Hello. So we're up to the second speaker now in what was the Canadian Conference on Unity, Sovereignty, and Prosperity from November 30th, 2002. 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago now. So the next speaker is John Godfrey. And this speech, this is a good speech. It ages very well. It is still very relevant today. Some of the presumptions that he has in his talk, or like common understandings, are well over time they've revealed themselves. But still, his points are solid and very good. And it's a level of conversation we don't even have today about what sovereignty means and what it looks like and how we exercise it. It's like not even a question we have the privilege of asking. So this is a good one. I like this one. Okay, there's John Godfrey's bio. Is very impressive individual. Okay, so I made a couple of notes here about what he talks about. Something he talks in here about is the concept of the new Rome, because we're at a time here, 2002, where the Cold War is well over, and America has established itself. It is the dominant player at this time. And at the time we're looking at this, we're looking at the end of America's global reign. So I mean, from an individual's perspective, America looks like the threat because they're the dominant player, maybe. But given a Canada that is a post trucker convoy, we can really question who is the authoritarian here? Is the threat really external, or is it in our penetrated cabinet, right? So I think that's kind of an interesting thing, how that ages. Something else he talks about, another theme that comes up, it came up with Mel Hurtig in the former speech, is the environment of multilateralism, which plays a role here. It's always going to play a role for Canada because we are big in size, small in number of people and power. Another thing Mr. Godfrey talks about is how Canada is more aligned with or friendly with the Democrats and therefore less critical of the U.S. government. He does have a point there. It certainly was relevant at the time, but given this world of post-Ukraine, given this a world of a post-2014 world where U.S. Essentially undermined and overthrew the Ukrainian government, and you can see what has come to now. It's at a crisis level now. I mean, the Democrats not only were complicit, they were active agents in making this happen, and they always have been. And it's, it might not have been so clear for those that weren't paying attention back in 2002, but today it's hard to deny, and it's a terrifying situation. But anyways, maybe I'll have more to say about that with Dennis Kucinich's talk when I introduce that one. So, and what else? Okay, so in his closing remarks here, he mentions, and the questions are good to hear, and also something we haven't seen for a long time, I digress a bit, is this is a sitting MP who is taking questions from the public and responding to them, and giving complete answers. This is something, when have you ever seen something like that in the past 8 years? That there has been a real shift with this current Liberal government. Anyways, okay, so he asks us to consider some comments from Dale Orr. It's a writer for, I think, The Economist or something, but something he says in there, like pay close attention to what he's saying there, because he's sharing Dale Orr's comments, and it's kind of a joke, a little bit, like kind of making fun of a rather grim perspective that Mr. Orr has about, for example, healthcare, and whether healthcare is a good thing to pay out or not. And well, just wait for it, because in light of today, like you hear the audience kind of laugh about it, and I think it's kind of funny, but that joke would not fly now. It is no joke, given that we're now in a made world. Yeah, so that is something I really stood out. And what else? And also note they're talking about Kyoto Protocol, and this is the whole start of it. This thing about carbon emissions reduction, which frankly I think, given what's happened in the past few years, I mean, I think it's a hoax. So, something else you'll hear him talk about here is the Kyoto Protocol, and how this was something that they're really pushing to get signed. This was the beginning of the whole, agenda to reduce carbon emissions. Even though it hasn't been proven, that more carbon in the air has anything to do with the environment and whatnot, and given what we've seen now with the WEF and lockdowns and whatnot, and it's it's a hoax. It's a globalist hoax. It's a Trojan horse for global control. Something else. It doesn't really come across in this speech. I hope it does in some other ones. But this is a time, after the 9/11 attack, and the U.S. government would set, would manage the general level of fear. They would have green and purple and orange days and yellow days. You're just supposed to feel a certain level of anxiety about the fact that something terrible will happen. That's kind of the climate that we're in. It's not much different than today, where we just went through a pandemic apparently, and we'll also have other viruses that are coming, and the monkeypox was going to be a thing, and it's just it really is a playbook to generate fear in the public. I hope I hope that comes across here, that the playbook hasn't changed, but the content of it is just a different color. Really, it's kind of the same old. Okay, so that's it for my comments, and we'll watch. Oh, something else. Technically, have to apologize. These masters were recorded on LP, on mini DV tapes, and LP is not archival quality, and this thing is these tapes are 20 years old, and there was a time registration problem, so there's a lot of little skips or jumps in there. That's why it's there. Sorry about that. Did my best to adjust levels and whatnot. Enjoy. Yeah, one more thing. I just almost forgot. If you check out on Wikipedia, this is from Wikipedia for John Godfrey, but the thing that I found particularly of interest was his last kind of political activity here. He was appointed Special Advisor for Climate Change and Chair of the government's Climate Action Group in March 2015. And he held that until June 2018. I would really like to hear from Mr. Godfrey what happened in that time, because that looks to me like he left. He parted ways with Trudeau and his cabinet of the time rather early in its reign. So, I expect that looks to me like there's a story there. Would really like to hear about that. But, just thought I'd share that.
Member of Parliament. and one of the few real patriots in the House of Commons today. His subject is What's a Country For? Iraq, Free Trade, and Canadian Sovereignty. John Godfrey was born and educated in Toronto. He graduated from the University of Toronto and earned his master's and doctorate in philosophy from Oxford University. He began his working career as an academic at Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia, where he taught for 17 years as a professor of history, 10 of which he also served as president of the University of King's College, Halifax. John Godfrey is the Liberal Member of Parliament for Toronto riding of Don Valley West. He is the author of various articles on educational, political, international, social, and economic affairs, appearing in the Canadian Forum, the Financial Post, the Globe and Mail, Saturday Night, and other publications. He was a board member for UNICEF Canada, for CUSO, and Pollution Pro. Godfrey currently chairs the National Children's Agenda Caucus Committee, the Social Policy Caucus, and the House of Commons Standing Committee on Children and Youth at Risk. He is also a member of the Standing Committee on Aboriginal Affairs, Northern Development, and Natural Resources. In 1999, he co-authored The Canada We Want, Competing Visions for the New Millennium. He is the recipient of numerous honors and awards, including Doctor of Sacred Letters, Trinity College, University of Toronto, the Vanier Award for Outstanding Young Canadian, and the Queen's Jubilee Medal. John has had a long career of public service and activism, both nationally and internationally. With his knowledge and his sensitive approach, please let me introduce to you Dr. John Godfrey, MP.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. Those were generous words, and I'm delighted to be here. And I also wanted to say how impressed I am, as always, at your energy in organizing these events at just the right time. And to thank the other organizers as well, including Patrick Boyer, Doris Anderson, and David, for putting together this conference. I have to say that when I heard Mel Hurtig describe his condition in 1984 as, and I quote, really bushed, I thought, that's how I feel. If I have a text for today, for today's sermon, if you like, it would be from Abraham Lincoln, who in 1848 wrote to a friend called William Herndorf and explained his opposition to the Mexican War. Lincoln: allow the president to invade a neighboring nation whenever he shall deem it necessary to repel an invasion, and you allow him to make war at pleasure. If today he should choose to say he thinks it necessary to invade Canada, prevent the British from invading us, how could you stop him? You may say to him, I see no probability of the British invading us. But he would say to you, be silent. I see it if you don't. Well, I think this text is more appropriate than ever, and those who are fans of Lewis Lapham and Harper's will recognize that quotation from the beginning of his column in this month's version of Harper's Hail Caesar. Now, I'm not proposing this morning that along the lines of an American invasion of Canada that we reconstruct Wag the Dog or anything like that. But what I do want to talk about is how Canada must respond to the new Rome and the new Caesar. I also want to talk about the new coming together or convergence since September the 11th of two separate but related sets of ideas. First, North American economic integration, and second, our own independent foreign policy and our choices to make policy. And the impact of this new brew, this toxic mix, if you like, on our sovereignty, and hence the title of my remarks, Iraq, Free Trade and Canadian Sovereignty. My basic thesis is that in the 1990s, we, and I mean by that largely my government, finessed or fudged all three issues: the issue of foreign policy, the issue of aid, and the issue of Canadian sovereignty. My proposition to you is this, that it was because it was a time of overlap between the Liberals in Canada and Clinton and the Democrats in the United States. And that's why we didn't feel we had to confront the issues which we have to today. Now, it's well worth noting that even in the 1990s, elements of the new Rome were in place. First, we were in the world of post-Soviet dominance. We now had a United States which was paramount in military terms. Secondly, as today, the United States was pretty much paramount in economic terms around the world. Thirdly, the basic structure of American unilateralism was in place, although it was softened by Clinton himself and by our generally favorable impression of him, and because we liked the Democrats. It's worth noting, for example, that the Americans did sign, of course not ratify, the Kyoto Treaty. Fourthly, if you examine the kind of challenges which we faced with the Americans, and I'm thinking here of something like Kosovo, where we went along without much debate and without much questioning in an international effort, at least it had the fig leaf of multilateralism. It had some cover of international sanction, international institutions like NATO, and with some acknowledgement by the United Nations. What we didn't think about, of course, in much detail, certainly in this country, was it actually so good for the Kosovars? But it's also worth noting in fifth place, that even before Clinton came in, ideas which would now become dominant in our day were already afoot. And I'm thinking here of the amazing document that was produced in 1992-93, just before Clinton came to power, with people like Cheney and Wolfowitz, coming up with a theory of total domination, total superiority for the United States in the world. It was seen in those days as the answer to what to do in a post-Soviet world. What was the appropriate stance for Americans? But even there, the words "no peer competitor" wouldn't matter if they were the nicest country in the world. There was no place for another dominant power, even a democratic one. Now, those ideas were rejected back in 1992, but as we know, they have taken on a life of their own since, and for totally different reasons. Because Clinton was less in our face, if you like, we really had no tests of our exercise of sovereign choice, if we chose, as we did, to avoid thinking about these matters. It was more convenient, and there was no real hard-edged issue that we could agree on or coalesce around. When George W. Bush came in, took power in 2001, in a sense there was a shift of tone. There was the same old foreign policy unilateralism, but there was a more aggressive note on the ABM Treaty, on the International Criminal Court, on the Landmines Treaty, on ratifying Kyoto, on trade issues, on the United Nations itself. We already saw a new emerging America. And I can remember in March of 2001 being in a caucus meeting with Prime Minister Chrietien and the expression of his frustration at how this new unilateralism of this very recent administration was beginning to express itself. And it was interesting. I think that one of the little telltale signs was the famous Cheney energy plan, which came out, I think, in March of 2001, in which there was a kind of unapologetic quality to the plan, a sort of defense of SUVs as the essence of the American way of life. The factor of big oil dominance, given the administration of Bush and Cheney. The assumption that there was endless endlessly available resources, cheap energy, mostly ours, in the form of oil and gas, which would be available, which would mean that nobody had to make any tough choices and imperil the American way of life. A position that was not in any way critiqued or imperiled by the stance of the Canadian Minister of Natural Resources. And of course, Canadians were not exactly reflecting on what they would have to do in order to tell the Americans not to use our cheap energy. We were not doing it to ourselves. We were not exactly in a very strong moral position to do it to others. As we moved into the summer of 2001, you may recall that there was various editorial flurries, if you like, on the whole subject of closer economic integration with the United States. And it came from all of the think tanks that Mel mentioned, and it came from the ranks of my own caucus. There were voices who talked about dollarization. There was a big push in July and August, if you look at the editorial pages, for closer economic integration. And, of course, all that went with it, that is to say, the implication that in order to compete, we would have to cut taxes. If we cut taxes, we'd have to cut social programs, but that was okay because being competitive and having a higher standard of living, that is income per capita, was more important than everything else, including social programs. Well, then comes September the 11th. And I think it's fair to say that there was an extraordinary brief moment in which all the ground shifted for everybody, including ourselves. I think that Canadians were genuinely shocked and appalled and sympathetic at what had happened to the United States. I think there was a feeling of solidarity. I think there was definitely a feeling we could not be free riders in a war on terror, and that there was an argument to be made for going into Afghanistan, and we did. Also in this brief moment, there was a, and it's so brief, it's almost like the life of some delicate creature. There was a brief moment of multilateralism on the part of the United States. There was a brief moment when they said to themselves, this is not a traditional enemy. We are dealing with non-state actors. We're dealing with a phenomenon which is spread out over 20 countries, and we cannot get at it by state solutions. We may be able to get to Afghanistan, but we can't. That's not going to solve the terrorism problem. We need to cooperate with the world, to share intelligence, to follow the money path for money laundering, to check on all these organizations, and to have cooperation. And we can only get that if we treat people with respect, and to treat the international institutions with respect. And that's when, in that brief shining moment, the United States actually paid back some of its back dues to the United Nations. And there was a sort of synchronicity, if you like. Of course, the same brief moment was a one moment. Those who argued in the summer for economic, because now we had it all. We had really integration, we had military cooperation, we had a sort of an agreement on how the world worked, and one hand reinforced the other. But then you could start to see shifty arguments. You'd start to see people saying, well, one reason we've got to be but there's noble reasons to be in Afghanistan, and then there are less noble reasons. We got to keep the Detroit Tunnel, the Windsor Tunnel open, right? A lot of trade is depending on how we behave in this thing, and so they're very sensitive, the Americans, and if we don't, maybe we need one more destroyer in the Gulf just to make sure the tunnel, those sorts of equations started to emerge, but you were allowed to have it both ways. You could be both noble and a little more self-interested, and it all came together, I would argue, in the fall, although you can begin to see the fault lines opening up here. Well, what happened? First of all, I think the first thing that happened is that Canadians, by the time of last Christmas, we're now a year out, started to what I would say normalize. They started to get over it. They started to put things in perspective. They started to chill out. And if you look at the Maclean's poll that came out last December, you saw a beginning diversion between Canadian opinion and American opinion. Canadians were putting things into perspective. They were beginning to do risk analysis, which made a lot of sense. And so we were not as paranoid, if I dare say, as the Americans, and rightly so, because we had not been on the front lines. That's the first thing that happened. The second thing was that, and I remember, and this is what happened to me, and this is pure confession here. On the 17th of January, I live in Ottawa, and I happened to be in Ottawa when the House wasn't sitting, and there was an extraordinary meeting of the Defense and Foreign Affairs Committee to hear Art Eggleton, the then Defense Minister, talk about the war in Afghanistan. And I was roped in simply because I was a warm body who was available and had a jacket and tie on. I mean, it wasn't just because of my normal sterling qualities, right? I just was available, and they needed extra liberals, and I was roped in, and I went. Coincidentally, it was the night before that we'd first seen the photographs of those prisoners which had been captured in Afghanistan and were being moved to Guantanamo by being shackled and blindfolded and having their beard shaved, and we've seen subsequently those dreadful photographs of the way they were treated. And then the next morning's newspapers were full of them. And I, as luck would have it, had the last question of the morning of the minister, and I only asked him about prisoners. And I said, there's something I don't get about this picture. You tell us that we're going to be in active pursuit of the Taliban or members of Al-Qaeda, and that we will engage with them, and that I would assume that in the normal course of events we might take prisoners if we're going to be that closely involved, if we're successful. But you also tell me we have no facilities for taking prisoners. So I assume then that there are three choices we face. We take no prisoners, which I suspect is not your first choice. Secondly, we let them go, which I suspect wouldn't be your second choice. Or thirdly, we turn them over to the Americans. But if we turn them over to the Americans, the fact that we've captured them means that as an expression of our sovereignty, the rules of the game, the international rules of the game to which we have subscribed apply here. And we're on the hook. We can't just turn people over to the Americans without being guaranteed that they're going to be treated right. But I look at those photographs and I don't think they're being treated right. And I said, it seems to me that the expression of our sovereignty in this matter falls into three categories. There's self-interest. We don't want our prisoners to be treated that way. There is our morality, our constitution, our adherence to international conventions, which is the ultimate expression of our values as a people. That's sovereignty. And thirdly, there's what I call our intellectual sovereignty, our sovereignty over the facts, our ability to make an independent analysis and not just do something on somebody else's say-so, even if it's the United States, or particularly if it's the United States. And I said, I think all three forms of sovereignty are threatened by this unless we have clearer rules. Well, of course, you know what happened. We did start to take prisoners. We took 3. The count, as far as I know, is now up over 10. We've turned them over. We have violated the Geneva Conventions. We have not expressed our sovereignty. We have not lived up to who we are as a people. Because foreign policy and what our troops do abroad is an extension of our values and who we are as a people. So that was, if you like, a fine example of the kind of split that we were beginning to experience at that point. The second thing that happened in January was the State of the Union speech, which came along a few days later. And suddenly, we were dealing with the axis of evil. What had happened to the war on terrorism? Gone. No reflection, no sense of why we need a multilateral structure to deal with a multilateral problem of non-state actors. Suddenly everything was Iraq, Iran, North Korea, and then they added more, Cuba, Syria, Libya. So suddenly we were dealing with, very clearly, a new America, a new Rome, and one which while containing many of the elements that were present in the 90s, had a new tone to it. It was a combination of triumphalism on the one hand, because they'd been so successful in Afghanistan, and paranoia on the other, that on every major holiday we were fearful that something would be blown up, whether it was Memorial Day or whatever. And this made it extremely difficult to deal with. And it was interesting at that point that there was dissonance, and the Prime Minister, for all that you may criticize him, picked up the vibes very quickly and said right from the get-go, oh, if you're thinking of going into Iraq, don't think you can do it unless you do it by the United Nations. I mean, that was a constant line, and I think he was picking up what Canadians were feeling and telling us as parliamentarians all the way through. So suddenly we now have a divergence between the foreign policy side of things, the defense side, and all of those economic integrationists, and we We start also, after normalizing, to start worrying about, well, what does this new domestic security arrangement, which is designed to comfort the Americans, whether it has to do with how we view refugees or human rights, how much are we giving up here? And as part of chilling out, it was interesting, when Parliament returned in February last year, they ditched and radically altered one of the security bills because common sense had prevailed. So in the spring, if you think about it, there was one sort of last gasp. And I remember an article by Wendy Dobson from C.D. Howe, beloved of Mel, who put forward something called the big idea. And the big idea was, gee, we want more economic integration with the United States, but we don't seem to be able to get their attention. So in order to do that, we must, on our part, provide greater security so that we'll just surrender, in effect, all of our views of what we think about immigrants or refugees or human rights or bugging people or privacy. And if we surrender enough stuff, I mean, it wasn't enough to surrender on the economic front, but if we do a really big surrender, we might get their attention. There's an irony in all of this. Nothing would get their attention because that's not the way the American government works. It's the executive branch which deals with security, foreign policy, and defense. It's the congressional branch, Dennis Kucinich's shop, which deals with trade matters and energy matters. You cannot link them even in the American system. As Tony Blair discovered, what more could he have done to support the Americans, and yet they said nuts to you on steel. I mean, he could go to the ranch at Crawford and they'll still get him in the alley on steel, right? So you can't make those linkages. Don't bother, as we discovered on softwood lumber. What good was all of that participation in Afghanistan if it didn't yield any concessions on softwood lumber for people who make those sorts of linkages? So they're phony linkages. The other thing that happened during this period is there was a renewal of the debate on standard of living, and the Toronto Dominion Economic Group put forward a very useful debate. But again, the problem was that they put at the top of their hierarchy of value standard of living, as if that was that trumped everything else. And what's that's forcing us to do is saying, no, why is that argument wrong? What's wrong with that argument? What's wrong with that argument is that it ignores what countries are for. Countries do not exist to provide simply a higher standard of living. If that's what they existed for, we'd go in with the United States and be done with it. No, they exist to provide quality of life for their people, quality of the environment, and enough room, enough power, enough authority to create that quality of life. That's why you have sovereignty. And so those who were talking economic integration lost that. And we've got to keep that hierarchy in mind. Well, how does all this come down now as we face a possible war on Iraq? How do we think about these things? I mean, the first thing that is important is to recognize what Doris Anderson said, that this is a great opportunity to think about these things, to get it right in our own minds about why we have a country and how we express having that country. And I think that in a funny sort of way, I think I always follow what Hellier's doing. If Hellier's on the case, something's going on. You know, he's proof, right? I mean, if he's on it, he's onto something. The fact that you're here means that we're onto something. So I think the challenge, as we face decisions like what are we going to do about Iraq, where right now we have a sort of little fig leaf of protection called the United Nations Security Council. We hope to God they don't do anything wrong. For a while there in the fall, it was all depending on the French. You know, the French were the only people you could really count on to hold out, because we knew the Brits were gone, we knew the Russians could be bought, the Chinese, wanted a free hand to repress their populations, and so it went on the Security Council, right? So we have got to take advantage of this moment to do two things. First of all, we need to have the power, the intellectual sovereignty to give our take on the world. And we know that what is being proposed in Iraq has no connection with the war on terror except a negative and perverse one, that it will increase the likelihood of the war on terror. Do you think that an attack on Iraq would have stopped what happened in Kenya the other day, or what happened in Bali? Do you think that it's going to... Do you think the diversion of resources from the task at hand, which is to get at international terrorism, so that we're fighting a conventional war, is actually going to do any good? And as Mel said, would we be doing our duty as friends of America? I do not class myself as an enemy of the Americans. I'm for the America of the city on the hill. I'm for the America of Abraham Lincoln. I'm for the America of Dennis Kucinich and the Democrats. I'm for that America, and there are a lot of Americans who are for that America too. So we will not do anyone, most of all the United States, not to mention the world, a favor if we surrender our intellectual sovereignty on what we think is needed in this troubled world. And it's not necessarily clear, but it sure isn't what's being proposed, this kind of Manichaean universe of good and evil. The world does not work that way. So our job in foreign policy is to think that through, to express it however forcefully, and not find ourselves suckered into some play as a default position just because perhaps the United Nations Security Council goofs. So that's the first point. The second point is that as we think of what we want for ourselves within this country, we have to get the hierarchy of values right. We have to put paid to the people. Let me just, in conclusion, read something which I thought put the argument for the devil as well as anybody could. The devil here being expressed by an economist called Dale Orr. Here's what he has to say about the agenda on productivity. We've got it backwards. The government's throne speech priorities, healthcare, child support, Aboriginals, Kyoto, and the military are all, quotes, very much in need of increased government support, but this is not a productivity agenda. Measures to improve productivity would include the elimination of the capital tax, lower employment insurance premiums, better targeted infrastructure spending, fewer internal trade barriers, fewer restrictions on foreign ownership, and a strong commitment to education and training. Healthcare may be important from a social perspective. Hello, he said, quotes, but there is hardly anything you could do with the taxpayers' money that would be less supportive of productivity. And looking out, you'll enjoy this last one. The reason is that most healthcare spending goes to the elderly, quotes, whose days in the labor force are finished. How does that make you feel? Mr. Orr said, and a dollar spent on health, quotes, is a dollar that isn't used for infrastructure spending or finance reductions in the capital tax or EI premiums. Well, we have our work cut out for us, ladies and gentlemen. and so I would simply end on this note that countries do exist for purposes. They have to be deliberate. We have to think what we want for ourselves. We can't just assume because we exist, we should exist. We only deserve to exist if we have a vision of what we want for ourselves and where we want to go. And if you'll remember the motto of the Order of Canada, which I see Mel and others are wearing, which is now, by the way, part of the great arms of Canada, the Latin expression is desiderantes meliorium patriam. And note the tense of the verb. They desire a better country. It's not that we're giving them a reward just because they desired a better country. They desire and continue to work for a better country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for your very thoughtful and excellent address. It's really wonderful to listen to somebody who has thought through the issues rather than just parroting the views of departmental officials who have sold out to the conventional wisdom. If there were 100 people in the House of Commons like you, we wouldn't need to be so concerned about the future of our country. Unfortunately, There are very few, and I know from letters I've received from them recently, they're right out of the departmental scripts, and they do not involve any of the kind of insight and passion and care and morality that you have expressed here this morning. And those are the things that we need to think about, to reflect on, because they are the things that define Canada and why we would like, if we possibly can, to keep it independent so we can continue to pursue these values. Well, actually, you did very well. We have about 12 minutes for questions. We'll start in the back left over here this time.
Hi. I wanted to ask you, how did you vote on Bill C-36 and C-35 on November 28th last year, 2001? Those were the quote-unquote anti-terrorist legislation. You voted with your party.
I did vote with the party. I can tell you, no, but I can tell you before doing so, I talked to the man I most respect in the party on human rights issues, who was Irwin Cotler, and there were amendments made to the bill. I voted for them.
And it's a bill which criminalizes dissent in Canada. It's a bill against the interests of Canadians.
Well, I think, as I've said to you before, after September the 11th, we were confronted with the unknown. We were dealing with risks which could not be quantified. It would, on the one hand, have been irresponsible to do nothing. I agree, in hindsight, we overreacted. And I think over time, as you saw when we withdrew the subsequent terrorist bill, that we realized that as we came to know more of the facts, we had to put things into perspective. But it's difficult when you're actually up against it, trying to do the right thing with imperfect information.
Go to the back on this side this time.
Mr. Godfrey, Murray Dobbin. I'm glad to see you connect the free trade with our increasingly dependent foreign policy. I think that's it's an extremely important connection to make. The other, as someone who studied free trade for quite a while, one of the things that I've noticed is that in virtually every federal department, there is a sort of trade secretariat as part of those departments, and almost every policy that Canada now examines is put through that trade filter. I've often wondered how much MPs realize that in fact the trade imperative is a very powerful filter on virtually all policies that are considered by the federal government, because it strikes me that they may not even realize how strong that imperative is.
It seems to me that you could take the trade imperative a couple of ways. For example, I am strongly supportive of endorsing, of ratifying and moving on with the Kyoto Accord. But I see as a crucial part of the implementation strategy not only a whole new industrial policy to sort of forcing house for innovation, but I also see it as a trade policy in the sense that the world will need the kind of technologies we're going to develop in this country. We should not only do well by exporting more of them, but do good by reducing greenhouse gas emissions if we can get those products out there. So I am not hostile to the concept of increased trade in and of itself.
Front over here.
I'm getting increasingly angry because it seems to me that I'm hearing two things. We're told that we need change, and this whole meeting is about change, and yet I hear a Liberal MP getting up and telling us about a lot of good ideas that I agree with, and yet I know very well that in 18 months' time, whenever it is we have a next election, he's going to go out with all the other Liberals all over Ontario, the 100 lapdogs, who are destroying our cities and destroying our health service, and ask us to vote Liberal again. And I really wonder how, holding the views he does, he can do that with a good conscience.
Well, I can do that with a good conscience for the same reason that Dennis Kucinich can stay a Democrat, or that Paul Wellstone stayed a Democrat. You either decide, given the range of available political choices, where you can be most effective. I've spent the last 5 years, working on a national child care strategy. And I think by working within, for example, I finally got to a position where in the meeting of social service ministers, which took place a week ago, that some of the elements of that may be in place and may even be reflected in the next budget. So if you've got to take the vehicle that there is to hand and move it forward. I wrote the book back in 1999, The Canada We Want, as an example of how in the past we have collectively come together on what I call national projects, whether it was the Cultural National Project or the Human Rights National Project or the Medicare Project. But what we need to do in the future is define for ourselves in our times our next set of national projects. And I chose to do so within the context of the Liberal Party, however imperfect that vehicle may be.
One on this side, please.
I have two quick questions for the speaker. One refers to the idea that's floating around in this country that the people of the country should be consulted before our country goes to war via referendum. I'm wondering how you would respond to that. And the other is this idea that there's a crisis in democracy within our nation with regards to influencing foreign policy, but also the UN is not a democratic institution either. I think we've seen a lot of arm twisting on the Security Council. And how would you address the need to reform the United Nations as well?
That's a lot to ask in a 2-minute question, but on the first point, I'm afraid I'm a traditionalist in the sense that I think that the capacity to make treaties and go to war belongs to the executive, belongs to the Crown, and that there needs to be consultation, there needs to be debate, but at some point there needs to be movement, as we are going to discover on ratifying the Kyoto Treaty. Sometimes you have to do things, as Churchill said, sometimes you have to do things against the will of the people. When there was a question of opening up a second front in Europe and everyone was urging him to do it, and he said, I'm not going to do it because that would not be the right thing. So sometimes you have to consult, but I mean, you've got to also show some leadership. On reforming the UN, I think that would be such a lengthy discussion that I couldn't give it any justice in a 1-minute response.
Do you give credence to the fact that the UN actually needs to be rethought and reorganized?
Absolutely, but not to the cost of undermining it or undercutting its legitimacy. I mean, it's a thin thread that's holding us off from a war in Iraq, but that thread is represented by the United Nations, so I don't want to undercut it at this time, or at any time, actually.
Back over here.
I'm a bit confused. As far as Mr. Chrietien goes, I think initially a lot of people got the impression that we definitely weren't going to go into Iraq, and then all of a sudden he sort of moved President Bush into the idea of going into Iraq only under the auspices of the UN. As a moral person, why would we be going into Iraq under any circumstances?
Well,
how does going in with the UN make it less to kill people just because other people are doing it? Does this make it right? This is pretty disturbing.
well, first of all, the whole issue of Iraq being the #1 target is pretty bizarre when you think of it. If what you're concerned about is weapons of mass destruction, I think you'd go into North Korea, wouldn't you, first? I mean, if you were just...
The U.S.
Well, of course, the U.S. Talk about rogue states, eh? But I suppose in attempting to slow down the train, in attempting to say to the new Rome, you know, this won't work. You're really going to do not only Iraq a huge disservice, but yourselves and ultimately the world. If we can throw some process in which causes delay, which is really what we've done in the United Nations, and if we can also work with those elements, those dispirited elements in the United States, which are trying to do the right thing, although you might wonder where the Democratic Party is on all of this. We'll ask Mr. Kucinich, I guess. But we've got to grab at what's available when we're confronting the most powerful military power in the world.
The thing is, though, can I just ask one? Mr. Chrétien did say a few weeks ago that if the UN sanctions it, we will be sending troops. I find this very disturbing.
Which is why I was suggesting that simply to go on autopilot, which is, I don't think he intended to do, but to suggest that we would be triggered necessarily by some decision at the UN, particularly if it were one in the Security Council where there was a lot of pressure on of the sort you've described. We need to have some independent capacity to think that through.
Question over here in the front.
Paul, you haven't come over here once yet.
Oh,
You'll get the last one.
Yes, one thing, if Mr. Chrietien takes us into Iraq, I think it's truth to say we will be in the streets and in numbers. But I want to come, there's a lot to respond to. I want to respond to the, you said you were working on a national child care strategy. That strikes me as being something like 14 years overdue. And I work in poverty, and I spend my time trying to stop people being evicted and losing their houses and their children just because they don't have enough money, and that starts with the federal government. And what underlies everything, we have 100 billion for tax cuts, nothing for the children. That's demeaning to all of us. But what underlies it is, in fact, the last comment you read, which is reflected in the politics of both provincial and federal parties at the moment, is that we see everything, and especially people we have to spend $1 on, whether it's wages or poverty, as a liability and not an asset. And there is a contempt for everyone that goes along with that. And I think that is what wipes out the credibility. So I think there should be no question about putting all the money necessary into child poverty. Children don't need to be betrayed by us.
I can only say amen, and to assure you that I chair something called the National Children's Agenda Caucus, which works to this purpose. I also chair the Social Policy Caucus, and I think we're finally going to get at least some small steps in the right direction.
Final question from over here.
John, I liked your talk. Found that I couldn't really disagree with very much of it. But as a representative of this Liberal government, I have to ask you, it seems to me that your government is doing exactly the opposite of the kinds of policies and agenda to support the kinds of things that you've come here and talked about us today. You suggest that we need to have an independent policy. Canadians have our own views, and we need to be able to defend that. And yet, I guess what I want to ask you is, what kind of movement is going on in your Liberal caucus around the kinds of things that would help Canadians to do that? For instance, on questions of our information systems, the CBC, or control, and we're seeing increasing concentration of our newspapers, convergence between, television and radio and newspapers, something that can't be good for a free and democratic society where people can talk to themselves about what we think as a country. So you represent the government in a way, because you're here, you're a Liberal. You said that you've stayed with the Liberal Party because you believe you can work within. I'd like to hear you give me a sense, what's the dirt? What's going on in there? I mean, are you the only one, or is there a group of you? And what kind of progress are you making on these kinds of issues?
Well, I got to tell you a secret. There's a leadership race going on now, and what's fascinating, actually, we're caught between two regimes in a way. We're also, I think, impelled to do something more on a more urgent basis on the two issues I've described, simply because of the configuration of events. That is, that we're now confronted with that sort of clarity, or the need for clarity, which we finessed, as I said before Bush came along. So that on the two issues I've talked about, I think there's a lot of turmoil going on, and I can assure you that it's not just me within the caucus who believes that. But I think that as we head into a new regime, part of what we should be doing is precisely reviewing all of this. It's exciting. We should be rethinking a lot of these issues, and that's why I'm certainly sticking with the party, because I'm hoping that by speaking out on these things, that things will actually change in a good direction. And as I've indicated, it's not totally bad. I mean, we are going to ratify and implement Kyoto. We are going to do stuff on child poverty. It's not enough. We're going to do something on health insurance. But this is the time, actually, to be putting all those issues on the table, because somebody else is going to be running this country within a year.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you for your candor. And now if the Congress...